Dr. Urgo Banerjee, Dean of Arts, Dr. Topati Datta, Dean of Science, Dr. Shorbani Bondabatai, Head of the Department of Sociology, distinguished speakers, faculty members, dear students, good evening to all of you. I welcome you to the national webinar organized by the Department of Sociology titled Privilege and the New Normal of COVID-19 in India. Indeed, these are unprecedented times and the new normal impacts different sections of society differently. St. Xavier's College Autonomous, as a nationally acclaimed institution, has constantly endeavored to use its resources for the more oppressed and impoverished individuals and groups in society. In this regard, our actions and outreach programs have been no different in these difficult times. We have worked harder and steadfastly employed our privileges to the service of quality higher education, always being sensitive to the needs of the most vulnerable amidst us. The theme for today's webinar is particularly apt since we all need to understand and learn how to encounter this new normal with our critical lens sharpened and to ascertain the ravages of the pandemic on groups that are already on the wrong side of privilege due to their class, caste, religious, and gender location. Understanding must accompany action that strives for a just and equal society, a society where privileges are shared by all and denied to none. A new, more equal world has to replace the old unequal world with a paradigm propagating equality from spatial and temporal dimensions. In a recent article, Amartya Sen placed a working hypothesis in the public domain that becomes evident from the title of his essay, quote, "A better society can emerge from the lockdowns," unquote. Financial Times, April 15th. Since essay moves around the contention that equity and distribution should be the central most policy concern under these stressful conditions of the lockdowns during the pandemic. The concerned need for equity and distributional aspects in the development paradigm become prominent, especially during time of crisis. The concerns of migrant workers, unorganized sectors, daily wages, the non-pensioned senior citizens, the marginal farmers who are not connected to the market get featured by the media almost every day. The pains and anguishes of the migrant workers in the lockdown nation brought to the fore the crucial role that the market forces played so far, and the government failed summarily. In the name of promoting private investment and helping businesses, while it is good that interest rates are being brought down, the governments over the years seem to have been completely oblivious of the fact that the senior citizens retire with a fixed pool of fund with almost no further accrual of incomes. They rely on the interest earned from the fixed savings. There is no doubt that the widespread apprehensions of poverty, hunger, and unemployment have brought about a feeling that the government has to play its role as market forces cannot do so under lockdown. Pandemics have generally been associated with the economic slums, as one may find historically. India needs to grow. The growth obsession of the Indian economy has made it forget the criticality of distribution and equity. The pandemic's now a reminder of that. The welfare state cannot emerge only through the promotion of the concerns of equity. The development paradigm has to bring in concerns of the ecosystem and the environment into it as the third pillar of development. It is now well understood with the experience of pandemic, the diseases that large-scale land use change often impedes on an important regulating service of the ecosystem that occurs in the form of disease and infection control. From that perspective, the pandemic creates an opportunity for democratically elected governments to create the best distribution practices and institutions and continue with them in the post-pandemic world. I add and rephrase a new quote, more equal new normal world, unquote, has to replace the old unequal world. But that needs a paradigm provocating equality, not only from the spatial dimension, but also from a temporal dimension, making it sustainable. This webinar will definitely enrich us through its journey on the margins of heteronormativity, education as a class privilege due to the advent of digital medium, minority rights, concern for mental illness, gender and religious nationalism, and caste and intersectionality during these trying times. I wish to congratulate the Department of Sociology for its efforts to begin the MA program this year and for striving to maintain a vibrant academic and research culture in the college, even virtually during these challenging times. My best wishes to all the distinguished guest speakers for today. I am sure this evening will be a mentally stimulating one. Wish you all the best. May God bless you. Stay safe and let us enjoy this evening deliberation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father, for that enlightening speech. We would now hand over the course of the webinar to the head of the department, Dr. Sharbani Bandhopadhyay, who is going to introduce the speakers briefly and the moderator as well.
Good evening, and thank you, Father, for your speech. I welcome all of you to our national webinar on privilege and the new normal of COVID-19 in India. I'd introduce the speakers. We have with us Dr. U. Vindhya, who is Professor of Psychology, School of Gender Studies, and is the Deputy Director of Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad. She will speak on privilege and mental illness, intersecting connections in concept and practice. Our second speaker, Dr. Urmila Bhedikar, is Associate Professor, Department of Sociology, Shiv Nadar University, Uttar Pradesh. Her topic is New Concepts for the New Normal. Our third speaker is Dr. Rekha Pappu, who is Associate Professor and Chairperson, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Azim Premji School of Education, TISS, Hyderabad. She will speak on diversity and disparities among learners, understanding the new educational contexts in India. Our moderator is Shweta Chakraborty, who is currently a PhD scholar in Dublin City University, Ireland. Shweta was also our student, so a warm welcome to all of you and all those who have joined us for this webinar. Can we have now Dr. U. Vindhya, please?
Yeah. Again, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am,
Yes.
you are audible.
Yeah. As I keep saying, this is the standard form of greeting these days. Am I audible and am I visible? So good evening, and thank you very much to St. Xavier's College and the organizers of this webinar for this opportunity to connect and interact with all of you on this particular theme of privilege. And I'm very glad to see that the focal theme is on understanding privilege, understanding the varied dynamics and manifestations of privilege, because not only is the topic very relevant to contemporary times, but it resonates directly with the power of privilege, being manifested through caste, gender, religion, in stark terms, as evident in the recent caste and gender violence in the Hathras, rape and murder case, and in the ramming down of the Citizenship Amendment Act earlier this year. Just to give a few examples. And in the context of the COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdown, one of the most haunting, visible, and enduring images have been that of the long lines of migrant workers walking home and their loss of livelihoods, wages, and dispossession all speak of unprivilege, so to say. And whoever said that COVID-19 is a great equalizer, that it affects celebrities, heads of state, and common people alike, is actually very privileged in my view. So let me straight away make my position clear. I've been asked to speak about mental health and illness in the context of COVID. And I take an intersectional perspective, a term that I draw from the field of gender studies. And I also take a social justice, public health perspective that comes from the social determinants model of mental illness in psychology and psychiatry. I'm not very sure who the audience here is and whether there is a sizable number of students of psychology and from the mental health disciplines. So I'll try not to use too heavy, incomprehensible jargon. Just to make my point clear, the intersectional perspective refers to an understanding of power relations and oppression, as we have learned it, operating along gender, class, caste, race lines, in which these axes of discrimination and inequality not only add up, but mutually reinforce and intertwine with each other in specific historical and geopolitical contexts. And the second perspective, the social determinants model, urges us to look at these intersections of social categories of caste, class, religion, and so on, and how they affect mental health. So thus the social determinants model is actually a critique of the dominant perspective, which is the biomedical model, wherein causes of mental illness are sought to be located within the biology of the individual, thus overlooking the social causative factors of mental illness. So although the biomedical model has been, the dominant perspective, the social determinants model challenges the dominance of this biomedical perspective. In other words, the intersectional social determinants perspective allows us to look at how lack of privilege affects and shapes patterns of mental illness. Now, what about COVID? One may ask whether any new patterns of mental illness are emerging and what exactly have been the manifestations on mental health. Now, the first aspect that we need to recognize is that COVID, or for that matter, any disease outbreak, affects people differently, depending on their social location and recognizing the extent to which pandemics differentially affect people is the fundamental step in understanding the primary and secondary effects of any health emergency. So the differential influence or differential effect of COVID on people is the first point that we need to keep in mind. The second aspect is that COVID has been found to intensify or exacerbate the pre-existing vulnerabilities and inequalities, as well as worsen the already existing pressures on health, on economic resources, food, and so on. So given this kind of a context, in order to understand the mental health crisis that India faces in relation to COVID, we need to look at the situation that existed prior to the pandemic, before the pandemic. Also, it may be useful to consider the impact of the pandemic on mental health in two phases. The first phase has been described or has been referred to as the acute phase that coincided with the lockdown, that is, late March, April, and May, and also the period when the pandemic surged across the country. The second phase, which is, from the beginning of the unlock, as they call it, is still unfolding. And although it is being called the phase of adaptation by mental health experts, where the initial uncertainty, anxiety, and fear about the future, about dying, about contracting the virus, about the health of loved ones, etc., these kind of anxieties and fears are perhaps abating a bit, but the economic fallouts of the pandemic and their psychological impact, they are still very far-reaching in this second phase. So to go back to the question of how privilege or lack of privilege affects mental illness, I would like to take up the axis of gender and how the COVID has affected women in particular. So to reiterate the first point that I had made about COVID intensifying already existing vulnerabilities and inequalities in health patterns, I would like to just take a minute or two to talk about what has been the research, what has epidemiological research been telling us about gender differences in mental health. And this research leads us to 2 pointers. One, research has found that there are no significant gender differences in what are known as severe mental disorders. Again, as I said, I don't want to use too much of jargon, but severe mental disorders are those disorders that are characterized by severe disturbances in cognition, that is in thought, in emotion, and behavior, leading to dysfunction in, in almost all aspects of life. So no gender differences have been found in severe mental disorders, which means that both men and women have equal chances of getting affected. And the point to be noted here is that the causes of these disorders, of these severe mental disorders, are biological in origin. The second pointer which comes from this research is that women are found to be overrepresented, significantly overrepresented in what are known as common mental disorders. These disorders are characterized by a lot of distress, depression, and anxiety in particular, but are not associated with the kind of dysfunction and withdrawal from reality as evident in the severe mental disorders. Now, again, the point to be noted here is that the causes of common mental disorders are psychosocial in origin, unlike the severe mental disorders that are biological in origin. So by psychosocial, what we mean is that the causes for women to be overrepresented in common mental disorders are located in the kind of roles, the kind of work, and the kind of position women have in society. And two specific psychosocial causes have consistently shown up in research. Two causes of women being overrepresented in common mental disorders. One of the first causes is the disproportionate burden of caregiving that women perform. And the second cause is the high rates of violence, gender-based violence. It could be, domestic violence, it could be sexual violence, abuse of different kinds that are by now well documented social determinants of mental health problems in women. So the first cause is the disproportionate burden of caregiving, and the second is violence. Now, both these factors, caregiving and gender-based violence, both of which have to do with unequal power relations between the genders, have taken on a greater poignance and a greater significance in the context of COVID and the subsequent lockdown. We now have considerable research to show that both burden of caregiving and violence had in fact got increased or exacerbated during the lockdown. And as I said, there is research from across the world and from India to point out to this. Also to show that women have been under severe pressure or greater domestic workload, as well as being subjected to greater domestic violence in particular during the COVID and particularly during the lockdown. In fact, from my own work, from the data that we collected from what are known as one-stop centers in the state of Telangana, these centers came in the wake of, the infamous Nirbhaya case. And these are centers to provide a wide range of services from medical to legal to psychosocial services to girls and women who are affected by violence. So from the data that we collected from these one-stop centers, we found a spike in domestic violence cases during the lockdown in particular. There was increase in calls to helplines and demand for emergency shelter services. In fact, a lot of research keeps referring to violence against women or describing violence against women as a shadow pandemic. And this is from surveys conducted by, across the world as well as in India. So data so far suggests that domestic violence in particular, and as I said, specifically during the acute phase that coincided with the lockdown, acted like an opportunistic infection flourishing in conditions created by the pandemic. In fact, the relationship between domestic violence and the lockdown was that, movement restrictions been associated with loss of income, with overcrowding, with stress, with anxiety, maybe making violence more frequent and more severe. In fact, when we spoke to our counselors from these one-stop centers, they reported that there has been an increase in abusive, impulsive, and controlling behaviors, as isolation gives more power to the abuser to call the shots. Furthermore, women whose livelihoods have been affected by the crisis might also be in financial distress, due to which they may be unable to remove themselves from the violent household. And a related point is that more than 80% of women in India work in the informal sector. And if this sector is hit the hardest by economic fallouts of COVID, then loss of income opportunities can not only lead to acute financial stress, but also to mental health consequences, as well as to higher rates of domestic violence. So when I spoke to these counselors, they told me that in several cases, there is already a pre-existing strain and tension, which got intensified due to the lockdown restrictions. So as security, health, and financial worries create tensions and strains, these are accentuated by the cramped and confined living conditions, particularly during the lockdown period. Secondly, apart from different forms of violence, there is evidence to show that beyond the health crisis, COVID also created a care crisis. In fact, time use surveys have shown that women are shouldering even greater burden. Now, of course, it's fairly well known, shouldering even greater burden of domestic and care work at the cost of their well-being. In fact, COVID has put the spotlight on care work. And as I said earlier, the disproportionate burden of caregiving, which is already a well-documented psychosocial factor leading to depression and anxiety, in women. Lastly, I would just like to touch upon, this point of mental health care and services. What about mental health care and services? Although in recent times there has been a lot of media attention and campaigns to visibilize mental health and reduce the stigma, yet mental health is still, mental health care still occupies a minuscule share. I think it is 0.06% of budgetary allocations to health in India. So the reluctance to apportion a budget for mental health stems from partly, from the failure to see mental health as a development issue. And the inability to kind of connect or join the dots between mental health and social conditions of poverty and inequality give rise to this failure to see mental health as a development issue. In fact, mental illness and poverty and social inequalities are actually intricate parts of a vicious cycle. So the cycle is such that poverty and social exclusion on account of caste, gender, or sexual identity increases the risk of mental health conditions. And conversely, those living with mental health conditions are more likely to drift into poverty. So within this kind of a cycle, as I said, vicious cycle of mental illness and poverty, certain groups emerge more vulnerable than others. And with the result that social hierarchies of gender, of sexual orientation, of economic status, of caste, of ability, and so on, they exclude, marginalize, and isolate certain groups. Consequently, we find that marginalized groups that hold lower positions within these social hierarchies, experience greater levels of mental distress. So therefore, the point that I'm trying to make is that mental health, therefore, cannot be viewed in isolation. In fact, the World Health Organization's, I think it was the Comprehensive Mental Health Action Plan of 2013 to 20, advocates for mainstreaming mental health interventions into poverty reduction, development policies, and strategies and interventions. And fostering the linkages between mental health service providers and allied service providers for livelihoods, health, government welfare schemes, and so on, is important. So therefore, I would like to conclude by saying that we need to locate mental health within within socio-cultural, economic, and political context, rather than from that narrow domain of the biomedical perspective, which is the dominant perspective in mental health disciplines. So we need to take a closer look at how intersections of poverty, casteism, misogyny, and other forms of violence that are so rampant today, how they impact mental health and include mental health as a key ingredient across development programs. Unfortunately, the National Mental Health Program does not take this intersectional view, but there is very good work done largely in the in the non-governmental organization sector, wherein community mental health organizations not only have adopted this kind of a social justice, public health perspective, but they have implemented several interventions in this direction. So I don't know how much time I have taken. So thank you very much once again. And I would be glad if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vindhya. Thank you. Hi, I'm Shweta. I will be moderating the event. And what was very interesting about your presentation, Dr. Vindhya, was that we keep listening about mental health. We have been talking about depression constantly, but the data was really important. That empirical evidence to show that it is really happening was very, very important. I'm sure a lot of us have a lot of questions. We have quite a few listeners in YouTube also. So I would request everyone who has a question to type in your questions with your name and your institutional affiliation into the YouTube comment box, and we would take all questions after all the speakers have finished talking. Thank you again, Dr. Vindhya. It was really, really enlightening, your speech. We will go on, therefore, to the next speaker, who is Dr. Birdekar, who will be speaking on new concepts for the new normal. What is interesting, I think, is the new here. We are constantly speaking of the new. So there are two news in Dr. Birdekar's speech. And I would love to, if Dr. Birdekar could just, yes, you're here. Thank you so much. So I would give the floor to you.
Thank you. And I also want to thank the colleagues in the Department of Sociology in St. Xavier's College, especially Dr. Shavani Shapnam for her invitation to present in this webinar. Their determination to host this webinar in the atmosphere of fear and the fear of signification of identities is appreciated. This is not so new a normal, we might say. We know that this normal and its normativity it implies. It has been gaining density constantly and rapidly, but does it enter with a jolt when a crisis hits like this? This is one of the themes I will try and follow by invoking a different context and by taking a detour through an archive while talking about our contemporary. The basic plan in my paper is that I have more or less chronologically looked at certain deliberations, recent deliberations about the pandemic and about the lockdown, and try to work with a few of them to understand what these deliberations are offering us about the contemporary. The new concepts, therefore, for the new normal, I could have put all of them in quotations. So that's the kind of exercise that I would like to conduct today. The first one, perhaps predictably, is the formulation of Agamben, the Italian philosopher, where he talks about the invention of an epidemic, which was published on the 26th of February this year, where he invokes yet again the idea that the invention manifests, quote, the tendency to use a state of exception as a normal paradigm for government. Reactions to and discussions about this formulation brought out the gamut of the concept of the biopolitical, but importantly also emphasized the impending economic calamities and reallocation of social life to distance, isolation, virtual presence, and loss of communities as we know them. In a post to the journal Diacritics, published on 28th April, Yasmin Arif takes note of the above and more discussions and invites the readers to consider 2 points. I'm actually taking 3 points from Arif's post here. One I will take at the end, 2 here, I note here. One of the points is that the discussion about the biopolitical are not so much about the pandemic, but about an interim where the virus is the sovereign power. She says later on in the post. And to call, her second insight is to call for the biosocial along the biopolitical during this interim. Therefore, to shift the attention from the deliberations on the biopolitical to look at the biosocial and the kind of changes it will transfer to the more settled notion of the biopolitical as it is emerging yet again in various discussions. The biosocial that Arif invokes includes specifically in the Indian context, not only the vulnerable populations, the migrant urban daily wage laborers walking back home without hope, the marking of communities as infectious, the deepening of untouchability through a particular encoding of the concept of social distance, but also some new contenders like frontline workers, lifestyle professionals, flight attendants, students, street vendors, basically populations that would be understood as safe, even though as part of class status asymmetries. This suspension of the social economies is unprecedented and without an archive, Arif suggests. I agree, partially. I also agree with an earlier point about the virtual community that is acquiring the name of the new normal. This point is taken from the last paragraph of Sergio Benvenuto's post, Welcome to Seclusion, written as a rejoinder to Agamben. But I would also like to suggest, minimally, that the traditional and the inherited privilege is very strong and unshakable during and after an interim in which we are suspended right now. My focus is on caste and touch, and I suggest that in order to test this suggestion, I turn to an archive that I study. The year is after 1897, that is after the well-documented events of the 1896 bubonic plague in Western India and the murder of Walt Charles Rand, the plague commissioner of Pune in Bombay province. The murder committed by Sapekar brothers and the trial and the hanging and the aftermaths of this event are noted at the beginning as the beginning of a militant nationalism in India, but that is not really the subject of my discussion here. The story I tell here takes place in a segregation camp instituted yet after the outbreak of the bubonic plague epidemic near Ahmednagar, north of Pune. The story appears in a biography of his grandfather written by Ashok Devdutt Tilak, not to be confused with the more famous or more known Bal Gangadhar Tilak. This is a different family altogether. So Ashok Devdutt Tilak writes this biography of his grandfather. While doing so, he also draws upon his grandmother Lakshmibai Tilak's autobiography, Smriti Chitre, or available in part translation as I follow after. And other documents and sources, he writes the biography of his grandfather, Reverend Narayan Vaman Tilak. As the title of the grandfather suggests, this is a Christian family, and the family name indicates that it belonged to a pre-converted upper caste Brahmin origin. The specific set of events that I bring out from the life of this family here are to do with how Narayan and Lakshmi Tilak nursed the patients in the segregation camp presided over by one Colonel Crockery. The nursing extended beyond cleaning, feeding, and giving medicines to the patients, and at one point included picking up infected bodies and bringing them to the camp, and picking up dead bodies and cremating them at the camp. Here is my first point. Narayan and Lakshmi Tilak's work in this camp is not possible within the fold of the religion and the caste in which they are born. They must leave the caste privilege and inhabit the marginalized space of the converted to even imagine this service. The emphasis on converted that I gave here is a loose translation of a derogatory word with which Marathi language recognizes those who are deviated from Hindu religion. The inhabitation of this marginalized space occurs to them in the form of epiphanies. In the case of Narayan Tilak, of the intellectual affective kind, where he spends tumultuous years struggling with performing what he perceives as meaningless caste rituals that do not allow him even a glimpse of a spiritual fulfillment. In the case of Lakshmi, the epiphany is more visceral, spiritual. Her decision to leave caste privilege comes after she throws up the water after drinking the water that has been touched by a Muslim person. And then, as she is burning with fever, she thinks, it was as if I saw a dazzling light. I started to think, who made caste? Was it God or was it man? I am decided I shall leave my caste privilege today. This decision to serve at the camp came after another set of events at Epiphanies. About 2 months, sorry, about 2 months before the outbreak of the plague, Lakshmi and Narayan found a newborn baby abandoned in front of their house. Looking at the marks on the baby's body, Lakshmi realized that the baby must belong to the Laman or Banjara people who had been camping nearby and had now departed. The identification of the baby is not a deterrent to Tilak husband and wife. The baby is adopted and given a name, Tara. It is this baby that got infected with bubonic plague and hence the initial arrival of the Tilak family to the segregation camp. One day, the doctor declared that there was no hope for the baby. Both the husband and the wife did what they always did. Narayan Tilak opened his Bible and tried to find an answer to his prayer. Lakshmi fed a little milk to the baby, swaddled her, and left her alone to die and walked into the woods nearby. Once away from the camp, Lakshmi knelt down and wailed loudly, calling God to show mercy and promising she would serve the patients in the camp if the baby lived. They fulfilled the promise as the baby lived. As Lakshmi writes about her work of nursing in her autobiography, her language is specifically devoid of the traditional Brahminical disgust for dirt and pollution. Her inhabitation of the margin of conversion does not allow this affect. The camp, however, shows another facet of the caste untouchability and labor. I want to refer to two sentences from the biography. The first one, while describing the grandparents' routine in the camp, Ashok Tilak writes, there was no caste and religious difference in the minds of the patients, indicating the patients would be waiting for Tilak to come and nurse them and or pray for them and offer relief. On the other hand, he describes a bunch of cleaners at the gate of the camp, laughing and ridiculing Tilak husband and wife, waiting to see how long the Brahmins would last this work. At one point, this group of cleaners went on strike as they were not being paid regularly. As they struck work, the dead bodies lay abandoned. As Narayan and Lakshmi began lifting the dead bodies and loading them into the cart, the cleaners came forward saying, Sahib, hit us on our backs, but not on our bellies, pleading their work would be returned to them. This is my second point. The interim of epidemic, the disease, the reality of death, and the crisis facilitates a temporary amnesia to privilege. To forget our own caste is a privilege. The reality of death, the crisis facilitates, therefore, a temporary amnesia to privilege at the receiving end of nursing and nurture. But the same interim does not allow an amnesia for the meagerly possessed. They must claim their work, not labor, or else they will be totally dispossessed. So they must say, this is our caste work and we take it back. Outside of this interim and the infected congregation of the camp, and in normal times, Reverend Narayan Vaman Tilak would continue to inhabit his marginalized status as a converted vis-a-vis the Hindu religion, but fight within Christianity the double subjugation, the racialized discourse of the missionaries that stigmatized the native Christian people and the upper caste Christian people that stigmatized the untouchable Christian people. So this brings me to the contemporary commentaries with the idea that the interim is not a rupture. The interim perhaps is continues certain fault lines of subjugation and oppression and exploitation. I was looking again then at the concept, the new concept, social distance, and its various critiques. And I found in them one article by Charu Gupta, K. Satyanarayan, and S. Shankar in The Wire warns very clearly and critically the centrality of touch to the period of the pandemic. the idea of infection and touch, and the way in which the conflation of the scientific onto the normal. The scientific becomes the new normal, but does it really? That's the question they're asking there. The conflation of the scientific onto the traditional stigmatized idea of social distance gets exasperated, gets increases in density and intensity, and becomes therefore something that needs to be understood very differently within the context of Indian sociality. Aviral Anand, in another article in Wire, actually gives a very different insight. Or more intensified insight. Quoting Ambedkar astutely, he reminds that caste is like a virus. It has the virtue of self duplication. And therefore, the virus itself is something that needs to be understood in terms of its existence in the social body, and not necessarily only in the biological body. With these things, with these few insights, then I go back to certain examples which Vindhya also talked about earlier. I'll just name one or two of them. One, that is the idea of violence. The idea of violence, the spatial segregation of the public and the private during the lockdown, and the various effects it has on the increase in the intensity of the intensity, density, and number also of the violence in the domestic space that she was talking about. The other thing that we might want to invoke here is the way in which the biopolitical and the biosocial interlock. I specifically talk of the police brutalities and the various losses of lives, the murders, institutional murders of P. Jairaj and Benix. And what happens here? What happened here, I think what we are looking at now is a kind of intersection that I would like to draw between the biomedical definition of the infected body and the various reorganization of touchability and untouchability that is created around it, and also the intensification in simultaneous times, the intensification of touch in the form of violence, brutality, and its biopolitical connection to the police brutality. That finally brings me to the question of the rape. The question that needs to be asked, I suppose, and I'm speaking from Uttar Pradesh, all the areas are very close to me. I sit here and read Hindi newspapers and look at Hindi channels, and I'm trying to understand what is happening here, wherein two instances come up. One is the question of, is it really, has the pandemic and the lockdown and the discourse of social distance actually created any dent in the actual human behavior? What happens when rape happens? How do we describe rape as yet another intensification of touch of the untouchable, the violation and the brutality that comes about in the rape? One of the defenses from the village in Hathras district, one of the defenses that I read this morning was the defense came from the upper caste communities coming together with one sentence which says that we do not even touch the water brought by this community or touched by this community. Why would we touch the daughter? Why would we touch a female body? Now, the brutality of this utterance, the biosocial location of the caste and the way in which the access to the body of a lower caste female person is made available within behavioral within behavior and action, and the utterance of a traditional stigma now being used as some kind of a defense of one's own actions is something that I will not provide a conclusion for, but bring only to the forefront for further deliberation. I end now with one more insight picked up from Yasmin Arif's post in Diacritics, where she is now she talks about the way in which a new kind of social contract is awaiting, where the touch will have to undergo a particular new regime of trust and suspicion, the infection and the healthy body, and what that particular what that particular new social contract, a new regime of trust or suspicion will bring up, and bring certain other intersections in the sociality that is already so torn apart by the intersectionalities that we are used to talking about. So in this sense, she says, governmentality might move away from the politically recognized or abandoned, but find traction in the sociality accepted and rejected, revealing the potential of both social antagonism and solidarity that was always perhaps embedded in the phrase civil war. So this particular waiting to understand what new forms of intersectionalities will be created in the social contract is the penultimate point. And I want to then end with a new understanding of the phrase sociability posed against the phrase sociality, the given and the possible. Sociability, very quickly referring to Aniket Zavre's book on practicing caste, on touch and touchability. I hope I have not gone too over my time, but I will be happy to answer any questions on my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Verdekar. What is, I think, most important, because I also work on it, so it was very important for me to understand the discussion of biopolitical and biosocial together. And the term that to forget our own past is a privilege will stick with me for a long time. Also, I think there's a fear of providing a seemingly rational legitimacy to touch phobia, which will have huge consequences for all kinds of marginalized individuals. So I think this was a very, very important discussion, and I take a lot from it because I will gain a lot from it. Thank you. We'll also, to all our listeners, if you have any questions, you can mention the questions in the comment box and we will get back to them once we are done with all our speakers. Our next speaker is Dr. Rekha Pappu, who is the Associate Professor and Chairperson of the Azim Premji School of Education. And she would be speaking on something which is more close to home for us right now, because I think privilege means a lot in academia today with the digitization of education. So she'd be speaking on diversity and disparities among learners, understanding the new educational contexts in India. I'll hand the floor to you, Dr. Rekha.
Thank you. Yeah, let me also begin by, I hope I'm audible, the usual question.
Yes, yes, you are.
So yes, I would like to thank the organizers, the Department of Sociology at St. Xavier's College, for inviting me to share my thoughts, my views on the subject that the webinar is organized on. I will largely focus on what my title is indicating, which is the educational context of the present time, the COVID time. And also, if I were to say that the pandemic has altered our lives in ways that we had never before imagined, I would be just stating the obvious, and the ways that it has changed our lives have been absolutely dramatic. But I want to present too that the making of the new normal probably is less dramatic. uh, the making of a new normal, we are now getting used to this particular term. It's used so often, and so I would like to dwell a little bit on it. The making of a normal at any point is a long drawn process, a process of layering, of sedimentation, which has its antecedents, and then one builds a new normal. But then, of course, it is dramatic to announce, to proclaim a new normal coming in the wake of a pandemic. So it's almost as though in the post-pandemic period, we have wiped the slate clean and we are in a new normal. But I think, again, it would be stating the obvious that though the situation is new, there are some predictable aspects of it, some familiar aspects of it. The fact that the privileged are able to deal with the crisis so much better than the underprivileged is one such. And what then is the new normal in the case of education? And as has been stated by Shweta as well, the new normal, the most obvious manifestation is about the online teaching, the distance mode of teaching that we've all got into. And much has been written about the digital divide, and I won't necessarily go into that. But I must also say that since there's been so much talk about it, and the fact that the lockdown came when the exams, the board exams, which is the big thing for the Indian education system, as the education system in many other parts of the world. The online teaching, the distance mode of teaching, educational institutes were actually sensitive to the fact of this digital divide. Father too referred to that. And yes, I'm also drawing from interviews that were conducted by colleagues at Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, where they spoke to various teachers and headmasters from government schools, conducted surveys, and found that the government had taken some initiatives through the SCRT. They provided trainings for the teachers to be able to use the online modes, the phone-based teaching modes. And what many of the teachers, and these were interviews conducted with teachers from different parts of the country. These podcasts and the survey results are also available online, so many of you may want to look them up as well. What comes through is not necessarily a dark and gloomy picture, more a pragmatic response to saying that yes, there is a digital divide, but this is also an opportunity. We have formed WhatsApp groups, we have enhanced our own abilities and skills. And we have been able to provide largely visual material, activity-based material to the children, and they have thus picked up. There is, of course, the realization that, interestingly, most of the surveys show that over 90% of the families, the children's families, did have a smartphone. The problem, of course, was that this was just one device with a family when they had it, and it had to be shared with an adult. And when families that had more children who had to connect up for learning and for lessons, it was definitely a problem. So the teachers did recognize this, but we're trying to make the best of what they had, the situation at hand. Another point of reflection for the teachers was that um, they spoke interestingly about the dispersion of authority, that they found that they felt that somewhere a bit nostalgic about a previous time, but the others welcomed this new move where there was a dispersion of authority. They spoke of a dispersion of authority, the fact that the teacher was not the sole source of knowledge for the children, that they in fact had to draw on existing online resources. And some spoke actually of using drawing from, and this was Delhi-based schools, where they spoke of having drawn from the British Council Khan's Academy for government school children. So this was the surprising part of what they decided to rely upon, and the recognition that they were no longer the authority figures. So this the realization that you do not have one source of learning and teaching. So within a school, the teacher is, Krishna Kumar refers to the teacher in a school as a meek dictator who is the main authority within a school, but is in a less privileged position outside of the school. Not a recognized, the status of a teacher is not something that is valued in present times, as the comment that he makes. But the teachers also recognizing that even within the school, even within the learning space, probably their own authority is eroded. Uh, and this has consequences. One of the consequences for the teachers themselves would be, I am referring largely to school teachers, but it would apply also to higher educational institutions, that the recruitment of teachers on contract basis, the fact that you don't need teachers who are quote unquote permanent, who through their years of experience would be able to hone the abilities of children, uh, is not anymore required, because there is this dispersion of knowledge sources or information sources which would be equated with knowledge. That contractual recruitment of contractual teachers may or has already, we've been moving in that direction and would become the new normal. So this is one kind of prediction that uh, educationists are making, have been thinking about this, have been lamenting about this for quite some time, and see it once again in the fact that, so it's a question of devices is not so much the issue. Devices will be eventually going forward, if this mode continues as is being anticipated by many, there would be the online modes, the use of online modes would be much more. So in these kinds of situations, devices and access to technology may not be so much the issue as the fact that one is moving to a new way of thinking where the responsibility for learning is now vested with the student. And in this kind of a situation, there is no reliance on peer learning, obviously, or that is reduced to a great deal. And then the self-learning again would be enhanced for those with better social and cultural capital. So we see that some forms that are present have been commented on the present time. In the present time, are likely to continue in a later phase as well, which would then be is then being referred to as the new normal. Interestingly, there has been quite a bit of debate about um, the spatial and temporal organization of educational institutions. Further, to refer to the spatial and temporal dimensions of educational institutions, the fact that there is a physical structure to which the students have to come to uh, in order to learn, and that is where the teachers will be teaching. These are the fixed, inflexible modes in which modern educational systems have been organized for ever so long. And it's inflexible both in terms of the physical space as well as the timings of the school. So for a very long time, there were organizations, alternative educational institutions that held schools, nighttime schools, schools outside, and so that working children could attend these schools. There was, in terms of the fixed structure of schools, there was concern about the migrant children. And the thought was always whether schools and educational institutions could follow the students rather than the students following the school or coming to the school. So the debate involved those welcoming the fact that there was such a spatial and temporal rigidity about educational institutions, the assumption that the schools are a safe space in which children should be coming in, and that is the mandatory aspect of the right to education as well. This is the conception of an educational institution as one that will provide opportunities for children, for students to focus on learning in an undistracted manner. we are now in a situation, but there were also those who felt that there should be a whole lot more flexibility to schools. And the flexibility that we have today is in terms of online teaching and learning. It's also some schools, in fact, have gone for phone-based teaching, which actually places a whole lot of burden on the teacher, but they have taken up these challenges and are providing phone-based teaching. They in fact call up students, each and every student, and this was more so the case at the beginning of the lockdown, and mostly to make sure that the child was safe and in order to take care of their emotional well-being, the teachers touched base with the students. So now in this kind of a situation where there are possibilities of, there is that flexibility, or like it's again quite rigid that a student cannot go to the school, the debate has come up yet again. One does see, and there's not enough empirical evidence on this part, but anecdotally, there are instances where teachers speak about, and this is largely in the higher education space, teachers speak about students uh, being very comfortable within their home space, being able to manage the activities quite well. And there are instances where teachers have not been able to recognize their students because they're so vocal, they're participating in the lessons. The anonymity of the dark screens, the black screens, allows them to actually raise questions and switch off, switch on. So this is being welcomed by some students. But there are also students for whom the home situation is, Dr. Vindhya spoke about this, it's not a safe place. It is not a safe place. There is violence that they would have to deal with. There are attachments to the family. There are expectations from the family which they would have to engage with, and they get pulled into it. They're not able to actually work. So, and this is largely true of students from groups that we would call underprivileged, in terms of class, in terms of caste, who are not able, for whom hostels and schools have interestingly provided, or very significantly provided, the means by which they could put aside all the daily issues, daily worries, so to say, the requirements or immediate requirements of the families, that they did not have to contribute to that, and then focus on studies. Together with that, there have one is the present time in which there is online teaching, but going with earlier kinds of studies, what these studies have shown is also that it is precisely these underprivileged groups, when they come, students from the underprivileged groups, when they come to institutes of higher education, that they recognize the disprivileges, so to say, of their caste become much more apparent to them in ways that were not so within their own communities, within their own earlier rural locations, for instance. There are studies that have shown this up, and I'm referring in particular to a study to an article by Anveshi, which where interviews with students from a central university were taken up, especially after they were rusticated by the institute, because the institute did not recognize the kinds of issues that they had. And this precisely is the point of privilege, that the privilege, we speak of privilege, the definition would be advantages that are not earned, advantages that are not acknowledged. So the disadvantages, the flip side of it is that the disadvantages faced by other groups are as invisible to the privileged groups. And the fact that these disadvantages were not seen by the educational institutions, by the administration, was something that was much more upsetting for students who came in with different kinds of expectations. But there are also instances, there have been accounts, experiential accounts, where students from privileged backgrounds, those who did not know about the privileges that they have, did not, and privilege precisely is, uh, privilege is the condition of privilege is that you do not acknowledge it, you do not realize that there is that privilege. But interactions with a diverse sets of students is what makes this, makes awareness of privilege possible. So in a space where there is no interaction, if we are moving more and more towards an online mode of teaching, the peer learning, the interactions between diverse groups is, that possibility is increasingly uh, fading away if moves into the new normal with the same kinds of same modes of teaching, learning, of teacher student interactions, of peer interactions. So that is perceived as a huge loss, the fact that you do not have these kinds of eh, possible interactions among diverse groups, and diversity then just translates or transforms into disparities. So this is what might, the new normal might throw up more of these kinds of parities. I see this also because in an earlier time, diversity was uh, addressed upfront, and speaking especially of the Kothari Commission report, which spoke in the post-independence phase, there was an attempt at building the nation. This was the mandate given by the Kothari Commission for educational institutions, for schools in particular, that they are also part of the nation building. And unity in diversity was one very popular slogan. It was critiqued a great deal for its rather shallow kind of the way in which it translated into practice, which is very superficial. But we are now in a situation where the notion of diversity seems to be anathema. It's not something that can be tolerated. So there are, uh, so one is privileged because of one's gender, one's class, one's caste. But then the privilege also lies today in one's name, one's appearance, one's religion. And some of these you actually find them getting erased from textbooks, from curriculum, from content. So when one earlier spoke of flexibility within the spatial and temporal modes, one was also hoping that a student would draw from their own community, learn from their own community, since both the home and the school are important institutions that shape the identity of a student. And therefore a flexibility that allowed the student to learn, to be socialized by the community and by the school, was something that was welcomed by many educationists. Here we find in the curriculum and the content that is offered for learning by educational institutions, one finds that there are groups of students that can see themselves in that curriculum, whereas for others, their lives are just not mirrored. The possibility of finding it in the textbooks is remote at best. And in fact, I mean, I say at best because at times their lives are represented in rather antagonistic, hostile ways as well, in negative ways. And this doesn't necessarily help in the learning of the child. So there's a lot written about this part as well. So this particular balance of what online education can make possible, and the fact that there are these various issues from an earlier time. So one hopes for a kind of an addressal of these issues in the new normal that one is speaking about. The new normal, as I said, the fact I refer also to the new education policy, which was introduced recently, which is in tandem with the shaping of or the reshaping of educational institution, and is perhaps the best fit for, or represents what we would have in the post-COVID situation. It emphasizes also the online teaching, the digital modes, use of technology. There is a whole lot more centralization that the policy document projects. So the decentralization, the diversity that one thought very important is not captured by the policy document. There is reference to socially and economically disadvantaged groups. So this is something that the policy document does focus upon, but what is lost in the process is references to constitutional categories such as SC, STs, OBCs. So there are a few cursory references to these categories, but there is absolutely no reference to Muslims. This was an important category for the Sachar committee, which actually through its report actually showed that the Muslims in India were in certain parts of the country educationally more backward than even the SCs and the STs. So without a mention of groups that had been recognized as disprivileged, one is perhaps building, there are signs one can pick up about what the new normal might look like. But let me not end on, I do not want to end on totally pessimistic tone. There are certain, definitely many positives of the online teaching, if that is what we would want to focus on. There are positives in the sense that you would not be able to connect up. I mean, at very low cost, we are able to gather here. For those who want to access people, access information, access different kinds of learnings, the cost of actually traveling is not there. And in fact, I must state also, this may be the experience of other institutions, that the time of admissions, we had many more students, candidates come in for admissions in the online mode than we actually ever got in the face-to-face mode. So there is some reduction of costs, and this is there are those kinds of positives. So one just hopes that moving into what is referred to as a new normal, one does hope that post-COVID there will be a certain kind of normality, but all these issues that one has been grappling with for so long are not just pushed under the carpet, so to say, because they seem abnormal. If the new normal is going to make these problems seem abnormal, then that would be a huge tragedy. And one just hopes that it's not going to be the case, and that we continue to grapple with which kinds of groups have what kinds of privileges. The discussion around that, I think, definitely needs to continue. I'll stop here and see if there are any further reflections from others on this. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rekha. That was really also, speaking of digital learning, I think of course, there is a privilege involved, but for a lot of us, it has become so much easier to attend these webinars and not having to travel really far, and also attend intercontinental webinars. I mean, that was never possible before, I think. So that is something good that has happened in the myriad of wrong things that have gone wrong, possibly. So we will be moving on to the questions. I have a lot of questions. I can start with Professor Vindhya and her questions. That would probably be easier for us then. And most of the questions, I also wanted to tell everyone on our Zoom platform that if you have a question, you may ask it yourself. You can just send us a small message so that you can ask them yourself once we unmute you. Dr. Vindhya, are you there? Should we start with you?
Yeah, sure, I'm here.
So we have two questions, both from students of St. Xavier's, one from Rohini Roy and one from Rishi Modak. We have more questions, but I thought these two were connected, so maybe. So Rohini asks, do you think that the denial of the existence of interplay between various institutions in cases of violence, like the interplay of caste and gender, acts as a form of oppression and gaslighting? And Rishi asks, how important is the unification of sociology and psychology in present day to battle out infections like COVID and also economic downfall? So if you could. Dr. Vindhya, could you unmute yourself?
Must be some issue there.
Yes, possibly. We may get back to the questions then. And Dr. Whitaker, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Okay. So we can start with you then. Again, most of the questions are from students. That's a wonderful thing. So Rishi Modak asks, even though there is the abolition of untouchability and prohibition of this practice, we hardly see any changes in the rural landscape of India. What is your opinion?
Well, I couldn't agree more with you, but except that I will not emphasize this about rural India. That is one of the major misconceptions about, how caste operates, and it is something that one would like to believe from a position of privilege. Caste is part of the sociality of India and of the international. I'll just give you one or two small examples for you to understand. Take, for example, the way in which caste operates in the way in which manual scavenging still happens in, behind the various malls and the huge skyscrapers in cities like Bombay or in Delhi. So caste is operative at the level of work and labor and stigmatized labor. One needs to understand its operation. I mean, I'm giving stark examples just to sort of emphasize this point. Or take, for example, the court case in the United States in the Bay Area against the company called Cisco, where the caste, the denial of promotions to the so-called lower caste has now been brought together and aligned with the discourse of race and the stigmatization of race. So there are any number of examples that will change the force of your question, the focus of your question, and then the question can become a little more sharp in terms of, yes, it is abandoned in law, but that is precisely the point that Dr. Ambedkar made, which is that constitutional, constitutional abandonment of untouchability, demolition of untouchability, does not translate in the social, in sociality, and that has been a very long time a struggle. I'd like to recommend a film called Court by Chaitanya Tamane, easily available. Have a look. And it's set in Bombay City, and perhaps it'll give you a more convincing answer than I'm giving right now.
Thank you. We have another question for you from Ayushi Banerjee from Xavier's College, who asks, can giving up of caste privilege be considered equivalent to giving up caste altogether?
No. Simple answer is no. Giving up caste privilege and still believing in the taxonomy of caste is precisely the problem that was indicated again by Ambedkar in Annihilation of Caste, right? So the idea is to understand the modalities and the way in which caste is created to appear as a natural taxonomy, or to appear as a merely economic taxonomy. That's not, or merely economic taxonomy, because again, the word hierarchy cannot operate there. The moment you bring the word hierarchy, then it is a system of privilege. And therefore, those who want to talk about caste as some kind of a semi-natural division of human beings in various works and skills are actually trying to hide the question that is inherent to the structure of caste, which is hierarchical. And therefore, the moment we understand very fully that it is a hierarchical structure, the question itself then makes a different kind of formulation. So no.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Maya. We have another question from Megha, who can just, Megha, if you could unmute yourself, and also you could also switch on your video if you want to ask the question.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you to all the speakers for giving such a intellectually provoking lecture. My question is to Dr. Rekha. You quoted a study about government schools. So I was just interested to know what is the intersection of the population that this specific study talks about. If you could just elaborate that a little bit, because I was also trying to understand the kind of social stratifications that this population so more or less covers, because in government schools also we have many different kinds of strata of students coming in. So if you could just please elaborate on that a little bit.
So interestingly, these interviews with the teachers and the podcasts are available, as I said. They were conducted in with teachers from different states. So you have someone from Kerala speaking in Malayalam to an interviewer who talks to her in Malayalam. She was working in a private school, and her response was that all her students had a laptop or a tablet. So that gives you a sense of indication of the profile of the students. But most of the other teachers were from government schools. One was from Warangal, who talked, the interview was taken at a time when he reported that the area was a red zone. And the students of that school, government schools, so most of the government schools, the teachers spoke about them coming from low-income families where the parents worked as laborers, who had lost their jobs. But they were still able to work with these students. The teacher from Delhi reported that they could actually get in touch because the government modalities required there was a kind of repository or information base where each student had to also give a contact number, and that's how they also had the contact numbers to get through. But the only ones that they couldn't get through was children of migrant laborers who were returning to their families. So these interviews were conducted at a particular point in time. In May, so when the memory of the first lockdown was quite sharp, and things, the phase of adaptability that Vindhya referred to was just about beginning, but the migrant crisis was very much dominant, was topmost of the minds of the teachers, the students, and what they also spoke about was the kind of training I was struck by. Of course, this is not a huge number of interviews conducted. It's just indicative. So the fact that the teachers actually the government came forward and conducted trainings for the teachers, especially to deal with, the SCRT is aware of the kind of students that come to government schools. How does one engage with that? Which is why the Delhi account or narrative, perhaps it's just that it is Delhi, that Delhi schools or the Secretariat or the SCRT thought of approaching the British Council and the Khan Academy seemed a little like, it didn't quite gel, but this is what the person from the Delhi schools had to say. He was I think a cluster coordinator, so a cluster of schools. He was handling a number of schools, and he spoke from his experience.
Thank you, Dr. Rekha. There's a list of questions I have ready for you. From Moitri Adok, College, she asks, don't you think students of rural areas are suffering the most due to this pandemic? And I would also, Meghna Roy from Center for the Study of Social Systems, JNU, asks, how do you envisage the post-pandemic university? I think vis-a-vis a normal pathological and socialization of stakeholders into technology. If you could answer this, and then I'll come with more questions.
Right. About the location, I think that is also an indicator of privilege in this particular context. Mainly the reach of technology, connectivity is an issue for rural students. The fact that in an earlier time, against one's quite contrary to this public perception of government teachers not being interested in their work, not being bothered about the children, one finds that there is a lot of investment. There is, of course, issues of absenteeism and things like that, but you have many more cases of the teachers being very invested in the lives of the students. So in a pre-pandemic time, there would be the direct contact, which was not possible. But then many of you may also have seen videos of various jugaad by the teachers, where they have, with some easing down, they have actually tried to set up mics and try to engage children. Quite concerned that children will lose out on learning. Uh, of course, there was also this concern, a certain kind of obsession that we find with schools, that the exams haven't taken place. So the older children, what happens to them? They're losing interest in studies. So exams become the guiding post, so to say, for learning to take place. So apart from that, the younger children, they did try to reach out in different ways, sending videos. So one of the changes you see is that movement away from print to visual kinds of learning materials. That has also been in the making. So none of this is new. The fact that teachers had, about 99% of the teachers had smartphones. They had already formed WhatsApp group among themselves to discuss subject-related issues, teaching. So that kind of took them through this phase also. Yeah, the post-pandemic university, I think Dr. Bhiretkar should also comment on this. I envisage there will be this online mode, the Zoom meetings will continue to be used. Probably we are moving towards a blended kind of learning scenario. There are, so learners, students, where earlier one didn't realize that there was this possibility also. Those who do want to come, and there are many who do want to come into the institute. So when I begin my classes or end my classes, there are at times questions of when will the institute reopen. So they're not able to manage learning at home. They want to come back to campus. But like I said, there are others who are very comfortable, who feel that they are able to do much better in terms of academic activities, learning, reading, listening in, they're able to do it much better. So probably we would move towards that combination. Yeah, Professor Vindhya is back.
I don't know what happened. I just got...
No, that's all right. We went on. We'll get back to you with all your questions. Would you like to answer now? You may answer now if you want.
Yeah, there was one question about some unification of psychology and...
Repeat the questions. I will. There was one question which was by Rohini Roy. Do you think that the denial of the existence of interplay between various institutions in cases of violence, like the interplay of caste and gender, acts as a form of oppression and gaslighting? And Rishi asks, how important is the unification of sociology and psychology in present day to battle out COVID as well as economic downfall that we are facing now?
Yeah, to the first question, yes, absolutely. I think this has been the perspective of feminist psychology or feminist counseling, which says that we need to take cognizance of how these structural factors which contribute to violence, have a impact on mental health of women. And in fact, the origins of feminist counseling and feminist psychology came from, therapeutic practices which did not, validate women's experience, try to kind of question the validity of women's experience. There was a lot of victim blaming. In fact, the term victim blaming itself has come from the feminist critique of psychological practice. And also in the context of domestic violence, this emphasis on adjustment, that maladjustment or lack of adjustment was seen to be the cause of mental health problems in women. So there has been this tremendous, feminist critique of psychological practices, and an urge to the urge to look at what could possibly be the structural factors underlying oppression. See, psychology traditionally, I mean, the mainstream psychology has always been reluctant somehow, because it is science of the individual. It celebrates the individual. So it has been very reluctant to look at, what could possibly be the structural factors, and then put the entire onus of it could be blame, it could be of responsibility on the individual, herself or himself. By saying so, I'm not trying to say that the individual need not take any onus. After all, I'll just give you this example, I mean, from a different kind of a field. Let's say farmer suicides. Now, there have been tremendous, number of farmer suicides across the country. If farmer suicides are related to, again, structural factors like, lack of the minimum support price and, those kind of factors, then why is it that not all farmers commit suicide? Right? If that were so, if structural factors only were responsible, all farmers would probably be committing suicide, but it doesn't happen that way. So obviously there are personal factors. There is something called the personal, which is obviously interacting with the structural, but traditional psychology, mainstream psychology has always been rather reluctant to look at that, thinking that that is in the domain of sociology and other social sciences. Which brings me to the second question, unification. Yes, see, there is, in fact, something called critical psychology, which tries to kind of move towards analysis, better analysis of structural factors, which are, compared to what is available in traditional discipline of psychology. And also, I would just like to conclude by saying that it is this feminist psychology which tries to bridge the structural and the personal, tries to, bridge structural oppression and personal pain, because you cannot wish away the reality or the existence of personal pain and anguish. Say a case of a woman who is depressed or anxious or gaslighted, as one of your students said. There is something called that pain is real. But then how do we understand it and how do we link it to the wider context of structural oppression is something that, feminist psychology or feminist counseling does. And so therefore, yes, these disciplinary boundaries between sociology, psychology, and so on are artificial. We have created them. But the critical perspectives in psychology move more towards analysis of structural factors than what is available in traditional mainstream psychology.
There's another question by Krishti Kakoti, St. Xavier's College, who asks, how can we encourage society to do away with the stigma related to mental health and well-being?
As I said, in the past couple of years, maybe, 2-3 years, there have been several campaigns in the media. I think one of the most visible one was Deepika Padukone, who came on to national television and spoke about her mental health problems, and then followed a beeline, and a lot of celebrities made the beeline and spoke about their mental health issues. So, but of course, I mean, that is only one way of acknowledging or, as I said, visibilizing, mental health and to reduce stigma. How do we encourage? We need to talk about it. We need to talk about it. We need to have, dialogue about it. It's not very easy. Stigma is centuries old. Stigma is also connected with what we think is normal, what we think is able, and so on. So any slightest deviation from that so-called norm is always perceived to be associated with some form of stigma. So debate, dialogue, in fact, in our institute, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad campus, some of the undergraduate students started a campaign called Mind Matters, and where students were encouraged to come and share a platform and speak about, what bothers them, what probably they fear is a mental health problem. And many of the students told me later that that kind of a platform to be vocal, to vocalize their mental health issues. As I said, we need to make a distinction between what are severe mental disorders and what are common mental disorders. So especially these common mental disorders, which are mostly depression, anxiety, and so on, once you speak about them, then or have a dialogue, also understand from others how they are coping or how they are handling these kind of issues. It is, I won't say that is all, but that is a way, that is a beginning, especially to make in a country like ours, which always had several prejudices about mental illness.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vindhya. We have a lot of questions, so I'll ask my questions last. I have another question for Dr. Birdekar. Meghna from CSSS JNU asks, how do you conceptualize the public-private in this new normal?
Well, we can take some cues from the earlier debates on the public-private, which is that it has been an agenda within feminism to re-energize the public-private debate and to talk about the way in which the the domain of public makes inroads in the private and mirrors certain kinds of hierarchies and certain kinds of behavior patterns. But if we are to talk about in the new modern, we really need to think about the way in which the digital media is going to divide the public and private in a manner that is intensified. It's already a part of the kind of talk right now. Let me give you an example of how we discuss public-private in our online classes. I am teaching a course on feminism and queer studies, and this course has always been taught as within classroom, and therefore it creates certain kinds of discussions that we consider are to be private to our classroom. And now the course has become available on the online format. One of the major discussions was the kind of loss of privacy this teaching platform has had, because an earlier seeming public now is entering in the private households of my students. And several of my students have shared with me their difficulty to go through certain material of this, or certain lectures and discussions of this classroom, because they are in an earlier designated private zone, which has become now a public zone. Now this kind of, even this smallest example, I think will allow us to think of the reversals that are taking place in the domain of the public and private. But I would also therefore want to also say that public-private division has never been a stable division. It has never ever, even historically, has never been a stable division. It has always drawn its lines of separation finely and change in a changing pattern. So we need to understand the kinds of implications, the digitization, even the whole digitization and the giving up of one's thumb and one's iris and fingerprint to a digitized world. That also has made us the whole Aadhaar card, idea, or the biometric, the data that is stored in the biometric practice. Therefore, we do need to redraw certain lines of the division between the public and the private.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think that's very important. Also, there are certain lectures that are being recorded. So professors are not being able to deliberate the way they used to with students. So I think that becomes really important. Father Jyoti, if you have questions, could you please unmute yourself? And if you want, you can also turn your video on. Father Jyoti, yes, thank you.
Yeah. Can I be heard?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. This was something with regard to the caste system. The caste-based discrimination and exploitation is a deep-rooted curse, which is practiced by the so-called higher caste, cutting across the religions in India. This is very evident. There is an innate aversion, judgment about the so-called lower caste. Many of us are not liberated from the stereotypes because it serves our purpose and helps us to go up in the socio-economic ladders and upward mobility. More violence and violations on the Dalits today because there are some from these depressed groups who outshine the rest. It defiles the sanctum sanctorum of the twice born. Such aggressions and violation will continue as long as the oppressed caste raise their head and voice too. That is my statement. Any comments on this? Thank you.
I'll say something, but I invite my co-panelists also to say. This is the question that all of us think about. So, so one of the things that I'd like to say is there is also I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, definitely. But the way we look at the question now also needs to break the question free from a polarization of an upper end to the lowest caste. Because if we have looked at certain kinds of certain instances, take for example the Khairlanji rape and murder case, the polarization that we have traditionally talked about from Brahmin to the Dalit doesn't operate there. An intersection of class also operates there. The victim in the Kailanji case, for example, is blamed to a desire to educate herself, and to also her family was buying land. Now, so the caste question there has become a very different kind of question. That's one part of the answer. And the second one that I would like to say also is that one also needs to look far more sharply at the political resignification of the so-called lower castes, and the histories, for example, in Maharashtra, Karnataka, or in Andhra Pradesh, or in Tamil Nadu, only to name some of the ones that I am more familiar with, the histories of political resignification and the insertion of the so-called lower castes in claims to modernity needs to be understood, therefore, as enabling histories, as histories that allow for us to learn something from. the acquisition of a particular kind of political voice and the subjectivity itself should become a kind of enabling history. So we need to re-understand the way in which we teach the histories of empowerment and of enabling oneself. These are some two sort of comments to your statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Medika.
Thank
Could
you.
I also request Dr. Shravani Bandyopadhyay to, you may ask your question. You may unmute yourself and take it on with the question.
This question is primarily for Dr. Urmila Bhedikar. It's a kind of fear that I have, which makes me raise this question: whether the new normal that we are talking about, we have been talking about for a while since the lockdown, and the new India with its numbing violence, are these now becoming coterminous?
I don't think I have all the wherewithal to answer the expanse of this question, but I'll think aloud with you. Uh, the new India is is perhaps a nomenclature that defines also the new nationalism. I don't really know its outcome. It depends a lot on the way in which we start looking at and start assessing the resistances to the discourse of new nationalism and its viability within the expected lifespans of political parties' functionality. So that's something that I want to, or I want to allay my fear by thinking about that. The new normal, on the other hand, is a more global phenomenon. And that, I think, especially the new normal that is the normal of the markets and that of the technological representation of subjectivities, I think that is something that is slightly larger than the new India that I can imagine. So I'm not very sure that the coterm, whether they are completely coterminous. I think that there is a question of a more fundamental understanding of the human behavior and a slightly temporary, hopefully, imagination of the nationalist discourse.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rekha, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Take one last question because we had a lot of questions, so we can take one last question. We can take this one, which was very interesting, where, okay, I've lost the question, but I remember the person asked about the quality of education and whether the quality of education has been impacted negatively due to the lack of face-to-face interaction in the new normal. I think we have already, Simran Sachdeva asks that question. Also, Anamitro Manna asks, why do you think the students are losing interest in studies due to the use of online mode? It has several advantages. Papu, if you're still with us.
Yes, I am. Yeah. About students losing interest, yes, an educational space wants modes of learning. There are diverse kinds of learners. There are those for who presence of the one speaking is important. The kinesthetic aspects are important. For others, they'd much rather just shut themselves up and read rather than sit through lectures. So there are diverse kinds of learners, but a space where teaching, learning is happening, whether or not you're part of it, you're learning from your peers, it's so much more vibrant. So I think I'm not sure if one can generalize that students are losing interest. It, it's a varied thing. We don't know yet. I mean, I haven't come across any study that definitely saying students are losing interest. There are different responses. So I would say that, um, can you hear me?
We
Yeah.
can.
Okay, okay. I think there was a change in the screen. Yeah, so that is, and about the quality of education, there's a lot of debate about what exactly would you mean by quality, whether the focus on the disciplinary protocols. So there are those who lament the fact that subject teaching the concepts, there is a canon which is not delivered to the student. So that is seen as bringing down of quality, the fact that now quality and inequality are something that will have to be discussed together. I don't think we can separate them, because there has been the separation where certain kinds of knowledges are being regarded as providing quality education. So the parameters of quality would have to take into consideration diverse kinds of knowledges, the histories of a subject of a discipline. So you're not saying that what the earlier debates are redundant. So bringing to the student those kinds of debates, as well as newer forms of thinking, disagreements, debates, dissensions, those two, bringing them in is also a part of providing quality education. Packaging information is not necessarily what is regarded as quality education. So I'm not sure if I am addressing the concerns the person had in mind, but I would just say that the notion of quality is something that is being debated for schooling as well as for higher education, and that's an ongoing discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all our speakers. I'm sorry we won't be able to take any more questions today. We have a lot of questions for all our speakers. So I apologize. And thank you, speakers. I would also like to thank St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, Dr. Bandyopadhyay, head of the department, Shawnee, for also giving me this opportunity to moderate such a vigorous discussion. Thank you so much. I would hand over the floor to Dr. Bandyopadhyay for the vote of thanks. Thank you, speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just take, I think, 2-3 minutes to give the vote of thanks, or perhaps less. In the midst of uncertainties, an alarming rise in violence, and a progressive undermining of some of our cherished values, we from the Department of Sociology organized our first webinar focusing on privilege. Here, before thanking the speakers, I would like to apologize to Dr. Hilal Ahmed. I thank the speakers for bringing together different aspects of privilege in this pandemic. If we really reflect on their speeches, I'm sure we could enrich ourselves not only as human beings, but also as an academic institution that upholds values that are now being eroded. I thank Father Principal for his support and for allowing us to use the college, the resources of college, and for his speech, where he makes again privilege the brings privilege into central focus. I thank our moderator Shweta Chakraborty for agreeing to take up this role. I thank all my colleagues in the department, in particular the convener, Dr. Shawnee Shabnam, who organized it in such a short time. I thank Professor Romit Veed for helping with all the technicalities, and also our technical staff in hosting the seminar. I thank all the participants and all those who raised very valid questions. I thank Father Jyoti for accepting our invitation to come. I finally thank our students who worked really hard for this event. I now ask Dr. Shawnee Shabnam to take over. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to add a few things to that note of thanks that SB just gave. It as a convener of the webinar, there were difficult moments for us to even so much so that we thought that whether we should go ahead with it or not. Because there was a discomfort about the topic that on which Professor Ahmed was supposed to speak. So with those difficulties and feelings of discomfort, we went ahead with it, and I'm very happy that we could go ahead with it. And I would once again like to thank esteemed speakers for their enriching and stimulating talks. And I would like to especially thank my colleagues who have taken immense responsibilities to shoulder the burden of doing this. I mean, I should begin with the youngest member of our department, Professor Megha Marik. She was behind handling the entire technical stuff, and her team of students, of course, and Professor Zayed Al-Basset. He also very ably handled the whole team in terms of technical management. And of course, this webinar could not have been possible without the students. And I do want to mention some of their names. I'm sorry, I cannot mention all of your names. There are too many of you who have shown such immense enthusiasm and taken such huge responsibilities. I would just mention the names of Simran, Denzel, Jagoshini, Vasudha, Ronald, Raina, Mahek. Thank you for doing such a wonderful job. And we also got some support from other departments. Particularly, I have to mention microbiology department and Professor Shudeshna of microbiology department and statistics department, Professor Durba, who helped us with the technical part. We were very unsure about the technical part, and they helped us immensely. Just the last thing, one announcement. Certificates will be given to the participants. They will be sent to your email ID. So within a couple of days, you should be able to get your certificates. Thank you for being such a lovely audience with such a, such an interest in the discussion and so many questions and everything. I think we all enjoyed the journey and the event. So thank you so much. Have a good evening.